so the last section of Unit 1 is going to be multiplying and dividing real numbers. Okay, we already talked about how to add and subtract real numbers, so looking at both the positive and the negatives. Now we're going to look at multiplying and dividing them, so really this is again a focus on the signs and things like that. Okay, so when you're talking about multiplying, it's good to understand what multiplying actually is. So for instance here, if I had 2 plus 2 plus 2, okay, that means that I have 3 2's that I'm adding together. So what that means is 2 3 times. Okay, that's what multiplication means. Remember, if you're back in elementary school, they'd have given you, like, you know, 3 tables with 2 people at each table. How many people are there? Okay, it's that sort of thing, right? 3 groups of 2. Okay, is the same thing as 2 times 3. So I can either add them, 2 plus 2 plus 2, or I can say 2 times 3. Okay, so that's really kind of what you're looking at. The same thing happens when you have your integers, okay? So when you're looking at negative numbers, the same sort of concept. So negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, I still have 3 of these little guys, so it's going to be negative 2 times 3. Okay? Well, negative 2 times 3, if I added that up, negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, I'm going to get negative 6. Okay? Well, same thing happens if I multiply. Okay? If I add them up, 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. 2 times 3 is also 6. Negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2 gives me negative 6. Okay? Negative 2 times 3 is also negative 6. So this is just kind of a demonstration of, which I guess I could actually say that, well, you see the point. And negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2 is equal to negative 6. I don't need to write it twice. Okay, but it's just kind of to show that that's why when I multiply a positive by a negative, I end up with a negative. And when I multiply a positive times a positive, I get a positive. Now here, when I multiply negative by negative, okay, because you have to remember that if I have minus a negative, remember that's the opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. The opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. The opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. Okay? So each one of these is going to provide a positive 2, which is going to be a positive 6. So that's the same thing as saying when I have negative 2 times negative 3, and we get negative 3 because there's 1, 2, 3 negative groups here. Okay, so negative 2 times negative 3 is going to give me positive 6. Okay, so if I've got 3 groups of negatives, okay, and that negative out front is what I'm talking about where I'm subtracting. Okay, so when I'm adding, I'm multiplying by a positive. When I'm subtracting them, I'm multiplying by a negative. That's how that works. Okay, so negative 2 times negative 3 makes a positive 6. So, and here you might want to make a little note of that, that is negative because we were subtracting. Okay, just a good little note for yourself. But that's really how that works, and a lot of people haven't really seen the explanation of how it comes about with the negative times a negative make a positive. Most of us have just like memorized the rule, right? Okay, but that's really why, because when I'm subtracting all of these things, okay, I'm going to end up with that positive number because it's minus negative minus negative minus negative. Okay, if these were positive 2's in here and these were all minus, I would still have a negative 3 grouping, okay, but I would have positive 2's inside. So I'd be subtracting a positive, which would give you that minus sign also. So just keep that in mind. Positives multiplied, I get a positive answer. A negative times a positive gives me a negative, and 2 negatives multiplied together gives me a positive answer. So the product of 2 numbers with the same sign is positive always. Doesn't matter which signs it is. If they're the same, it's going to become positive, and if they are different signs, it is going to become negative. It doesn't matter which one. Okay, it doesn't matter if the first number, the last number, or the 50th number, if we've got 50 numbers. If one of them is negative, if they're different signs, it's going to be negative. Every other negative is going to make positive. That's kind of how that works. We'll talk deeper into that later on. Okay, so now multiplying. Okay, you should be able to multiply. You need to be able to do basic multiplication in your head. If you can't do basic multiplication in your head, I highly suggest you get online and you look up some times tables and you start memorizing times tables. I know we've kind of gone away from that skill in a lot of places, but it's a really important skill because it's going to help you throughout the entire class, not just in multiplying, because you will have your calculator for a lot of things, but having that number sense is what we call it, is number sense, and being able to look at stuff like, I don't know, 72 and knowing exactly what numbers go into 72, okay, is very, very helpful, especially when we start factoring and things like that. Knowing your times tables will really help you see the numbers better. So if you don't have your times tables memorized, please, please, please memorize them. It will help you, I promise. Okay, so multiplying, okay, 6 times 4 is 24. They are opposite signs. One's negative, one's positive, so my answer should be negative. And that's all you're really looking at doing. Okay, 5 times 10 is 50. Negative times a negative makes a positive answer. Okay, 2 times 1 is 2. One's positive, one's negative, so my answer is negative. Okay, doesn't matter which number's bigger or anything like that in these. If it's a positive times a negative, you get a negative answer. Excuse me. Okay, so now the rule. Okay, here's one of the rules. One of the big rules in math that tends to throw people off. For any x, okay, so any number whatsoever, if I multiply by 0, my answer is 0. That's what this says. X times 0 equals 0. Okay, I can put 3, 5, 7, 20, 132, 32 fifths. It doesn't matter what I fill in there for x. Anything times 0 is always 0. Okay, decimals and fractions follow the same rules. Now, you do have to be able to multiply your decimals, okay? It's a skill that we learned way back when. We should be able to do it. So negative 1.2 times 0.05, okay? When I multiply decimals, I do not have to line up my decimals. I'm just going to go 1.2 times 0.05. I just line up numbers. We multiply it out. 2 times 5 is 10. Okay, 5 times 1 is 5 plus 1 is 6. Okay, everything else is going to yield zeros, so I don't have to do anything else because I would get 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, so I don't have to do anything else. Now, once I'm here, you count how many numbers are on the right of the decimal. So I've got 1, 2, 3 decimals, so this needs to move to the left 3 decimal spaces. 1, 2, we're going to go one more, and we're going to fill that spot in with a 0. So my answer here is going to be 0.060, and this was a negative times a positive, so my answer is negative. Okay, so same sort of thing here, negative 4/5 times negative 20, which remember from the fractions unit, I can always put a whole number over 1, so negative 20 over 1. I can reduce, okay, just ignore that negative symbol out there. When you're doing all of this, and I'm reducing and I'm breaking down these numbers, just totally ignore the negatives for now. Okay, 20 breaks into 4 and 5, 2 and 2, okay, 4 breaks into 2 and 2. It's not really going to help me much because the only thing I can actually cancel is the 5 and the 5. So I get 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Over 1, and I had a negative times a negative, so that makes a positive. Okay, so that negative you just deal with at the end. Don't even worry about the negative at front. Deal with it at the end. Okay, negative times a negative makes a positive answer. Okay, so 16 over 1. We don't ever leave things over 1. It's just 16. Okay, 16 over 1, which is just 16. Okay, be very, very, very careful with exponents. Okay, the exponent only applies to the expression it's touching. Okay, this is what I mean. So here I'm touching parentheses, which means it includes everything in parentheses. So this means negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Okay, which is different than this. This means negative 2 to the third power. The only thing that exponent is actually touching is the 2. So the only thing it applies to is the 2. So this means negative 2 times 2 times 2. Okay, 2 times 2 times 2. There's 3 2's. There's only one negative out front. Here there's 3 negatives because it's inside the parentheses. So negative 2, negative 2, negative 2. Here it's negative 2 times 2 times 2. Okay, very big difference in answers usually. Not always, but usually. Okay, so for instance here, actually it's going to be all odds, they'll be the same. All even exponents, they'll be different. That's actually how that works. So it's actually 50-50. Okay, so here negative 2 times negative 2 makes positive 4. 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. Okay, here negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 times 2 is going to be negative 8. So those two happen to be the same because they have odd exponents. Here I'm going to have even exponents, so it's going to be a little different. So I go negative 3 and negative 3, right? Because the exponent touches parentheses, that means it applies to everything in parentheses. We're going to look at a lot bigger ones later. Okay, everything in the parentheses. So negative 3 times negative 3, which is positive 9. Okay, here it only applies to 3, so this is negative 3 times 3. Oops, I don't know why I wrote 2. Okay, oh, you couldn't even see it. Okay, so negative 3 times 3. Okay, well, negative 3 times positive 3 makes a negative 9. So here you can see with the even exponents, the answers are different. Okay, positive 2 makes, squaring it makes a positive 9. Okay, squaring it without the negative inside makes a negative 9. So be very, very careful with the exponents and what it actually applies to. Okay, so now I told you there was going to be an additive inverse. There's also going to be a multiplicative inverse, which is one of my favorite words to say. I just like it, multiplicative inverse. Okay, so it's also called the reciprocal. So the reciprocal or the multiplicative inverse. Two numbers whose product is 1 are called reciprocals or multiplicative inverses of each other. Okay, so in the last unit, I said additive inverses is when you add two numbers together, you get back to 0. Okay, so the additive inverse of 4 is negative 4. The additive inverse of negative 3 is positive 3. Okay, now here, this is going to be when the product, so remember that's multiply. So when I multiply the two together, I get 1. Okay, so for example, and I know there's examples on the other side, but just to have one right here. Okay, so if I'm talking about the multiplicative inverse of 2 is 1/2. Okay, because if I multiply them, 2 times 1/2 would give me 2/2, which is equal to 1. So when you multiply them together, you should get 1. Notice 0 does not have a reciprocal. Okay, 0 does not have a reciprocal. And again, this is going to be a big math rule. Okay, we can divide by, we can have a 0 on top. Okay, and this little rule will go with this. 0 on top is okay. Okay, 0 on top is okay. It's just 0. 0 on bottom is a no, which is why we can't have a reciprocal. Because with a reciprocal, basically all you're going to do is you're going to take the fraction and flip it. Okay, that's going to be your multiplicative inverse. Okay, and you might want to take a note of that. Take the fraction and flip it. Okay, additive inverse, opposite sign. Multiplicative inverse, just flip it. So here I didn't have a fraction, it was just 2, so I put it over 1 so that I could flip it. Okay, so that's why 0 doesn't have a reciprocal, is because when I flip 0 over anything, I'm going to get 0 on bottom, and we cannot divide by 0 in math. That's like one of the biggest math no-nos ever. Okay, 0 on top is okay, 0 on bottom is a big no-no. Alright, so I told you there was going to be some examples here. So find the reciprocal. This should be really easy. This should be easy points for you on your test. 22. Okay, it has no fraction, so we're going to throw it over 1. Flip it, and you get 1 over 22. That is your reciprocal. It is that simple. 3 over 16. Flip it. That is the reciprocal. Multiplicative inverse. Okay, know your vocabulary. Multiplicative inverse, okay, or reciprocal. Okay, so here, -10, put it over 1, and you get 1 over 10, and it is still negative. Okay, it is still negative because you have to imagine a negative times a negative would make a positive 1. We want a positive 1 for the answer, not a negative. Okay, and then that -1 tends to throw people off, but it should be pretty easy too. Okay, even if I make it a fraction, -1 over 1, if I flip it, it's going to be 1 over -1, which is still just -1. Okay, so the multiplicative inverse of 1 is 1, and the multiplicative inverse of -1 is -1. Okay, there's not really much to flip, right, because it's just 1s. And so that is the multiplicative inverse of -1. So that's super important. Additive inverse, you just switch sign, no flipping. Multiplicative inverse, you just flip, no changing signs. You got to keep those straight, understand the vocabulary, so that if I ask you what is the additive inverse of -10, that's +10. What's the reciprocal of -10? It's -1/10. So you have to be able to determine the difference between the two. Okay, so that last little section here, okay, dividing real numbers. The quotient of two numbers with the same sign is a positive, so this kind of falls into the same rules as multiplying. Okay, so if I divide the same sign, it's positive, so positive over a positive, or is a positive over positive is positive. Negative over negative is also positive. Okay, and then the quotient of two numbers with different signs is a negative number. Okay, so if you want to make a note of that, positive over negative is negative, or negative over positive is also a negative. Okay, so that's your rules, okay, for quotients, which are basically the same thing as multiplying. Okay, so -24 divided by -4, well, 24 divided by 4 is 6, and negative divided by a negative makes a positive. Okay, -36 divided by 3 goes into 36 12 times. It's negative over positive, so it's a negative answer. Okay, different signs, negative, same signs, positive. That's really all there is to it. Now, we did this when we did fractions, so remember this is a keep it, flip it, change it. So 2/3 now becomes times -4/5. Okay, keep the first, flip the second. Notice the sign stayed the same. This was -5/4, now it's -4/5. Change it to multiplication. Okay, nothing crosses out, because remember it's got to be top to bottom. No 2 to 3, no 4 to 5, no 2 to 5, no 4 to 3. So it's just 2 times 4 is 8. 5 times 3 is 15. Positive times negative makes a negative. Okay, -8/15. So same sort of thing here, -3/2 divided by 9, so I'm going to put that over 1. -3/2 times 1/9. Okay, here I can do a little bit of canceling, right, because 9 breaks into 3 and 3. So I can get rid of a 3 on top, a 3 on bottom. Okay, so I end up with 1 on top, 2 times 3 is 6 on bottom. Negative times positive makes a negative answer. Okay, that's really all there is to it. You treat them just like they're normal numbers, okay, without the negatives, and then you just work with the negative at the end. Okay, so here is that rule again that I was talking about with the okay and the no. This has got 0 over a equals 0. A over 0 is undefined, and that's what you will write as undefined. Okay, I always like the 0 over k is okay, and some number over 0 is a no. Just kind of helps me. Okay, 0 over a number is okay, and some number over 0 is a big fat no. Got it, can't do it, undefined. Okay, so now here we go. Let's do some simplifying. Order of operations. We've got a fraction going, so remember you can work top and bottom separately first. So looking at the top, I've got multiplication and addition. Multiplication comes first, so -12 times -3 is a positive 36 plus 3 over -7 plus 2. Okay, minus a -2 becomes plus 2. So on top, I've got 36 plus 3 is 39. And on bottom, negative 7 plus 2 is negative 5. Okay, so positive 39 over negative 5. Now, one more thing I want to point out here, because this tends to throw people off as well. Okay, and you might want to make a little note off to the side or something along those lines. 39 over negative 5 is the same thing as negative 39 over positive 5, which is the same thing as negative 39 fifths. Okay, those are all the same. That negative can be on bottom, it can be on top, it can be out front. It's all going to be the same. Oops, you can't see it. Okay, on bottom, on top, or out front. Okay, all of those things are exactly the same, because you got to remember that if I have a positive over a negative, my answer is negative. Negative over a positive, my answer is negative. Okay, negative, positive over a positive is a negative answer. So all of these things are the same. So please keep that in mind as well. Alright, that last one you should be able to do on your own. I want to see you try it. Probably hit pause. Okay, it's just a substitution method again, and then simplify it all down. Okay, once you've done that, come back to get your answer from me. So here we go. I should have 5 times negative 2 minus negative 4. Notice all my nice pretty little parentheses that I'm using here. Okay, multiplication comes first, so 5 times negative 2 is negative 10, and this is minus negative 4 becomes positive 4. I can do that at the same time. Hopefully we're okay with that by this point. Negative 10 plus 4 becomes negative 6. Okay, do the same thing here. So 3 times negative 2 over 2 times negative 4, which is going to be negative 6 over negative 8, which I can reduce. Okay, first of all, a negative over a negative, we never leave it that way, so that's positive 6/8, which then breaks down 3 and 2, 4 and 2. I'm going to stop there. I know 4 can really break down, but 3 is not going to go into 4, so I'm not going to worry about doing that. So those 2's cancel out, and I am left with positive 3/4. Now you could have very well done that from here. My 2's could have canceled from here. You just have to remember that that makes this a negative 1, so that negative doesn't go away. Okay, so then I would have negative 3 over negative 4, which is still positive 3/4. Alright, and that's the end of Unit 1, which will lead you to your very first test in this class. Good luck.